Hi everyone, my name's Dawn. I'm a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. I want to talk a little bit about grief today. When we are struggling with grief, a lot of us, we've talked about the stages of grief, right? You have that denial, that anger, you have the acceptance period, you have the bargaining period. There's these different cycles that we go through, go from acceptance to finally, then how do we make something out of the traumas that we've been through or the grief that we're experiencing. And of course, that's not a cycle. We can go in and out of these things. I think maybe what I'd like to talk about today is we're not aware that we go through the grieving process through a lot of different times in our life, not just death. So many times when we are going through the process of maybe a new job, maybe a move, maybe a child moving away, maybe a child going off to kindergarten or first grade, all of these different life changes that we might go through, we're going to go through a grieving process. I have a dear friend once who told me, she was talking to me about how grief is just love with no place to go. And I loved that because it made me think about my own grief. And with my own grief, I've really found a place to channel that and make meaning out of a lot of my grief. And yet so much of my grief I still carry with me. And I wonder sometimes if it's just there as that reminder to maybe drive me to continue on. I've talked before about grieving the ghosts. We often create ghosts out of the things that should have been. So the 10-80-10, the grieving of fantasy. When we create a fantasy of what we wanted for our future or what we wanted for someone that was maybe in our life now and they've left us, sometimes we're not actually grieving what was going on in the relationship currently or what was true about the relationship. We're grieving the fantasy we created for the relationship that we thought the future might look like. And then we're actually having to grieve a fantasy, not the reality of what life was with that person or that job or that situation. So grieving is very, very complicated. We get depressed with it. There's just all those stages of grief that we go through. And I often think that when we have patients or even myself, and we're going through depression, it's grief. When we're going through these anxiety things and these bargaining things and we're just really struggling day to day, it really is just unresolved grief. And we don't know what to do with that energy of grief. And we don't even know how to really define it. We don't know how to come to a point and say, this is actually what's happening here. I'm grieving this thing from the past or this thing that I created for my future that I didn't realize I had done to myself, that I didn't realize I'm still ruminating on these things. And even creating a ghost out of a person. So, we may have a mother or a father or a child that we turned into something they really weren't. We created a ghost out of them. And we created this fantasy person out of them that they should have been. And this person is still here, but we in our mind imagine this is who they should be. This is who they should be to me. This is who I wanted them to be to me. And so we had to grieve the expectation of this person that we created for ourselves because they were still this person, but we wanted them to be something else. So we have to learn how to maybe grieve those things and let go of that expectation that we wanted them to be. What it comes down to really is, do we want to choose to have a better life? Or do we continue to stay in the patterns of the mental illness and the thought processes? Because we do have the tools to get better. We do have the tools, not only the coping skills, not only the tools of knowing X, Y, Z. A leads to B, leads to C, and then I know I'm going to be here, and this is not good. So we know we can identify these things. If I go out with this person, I know I'm going to potentially wind up in jail. I know that these things can lead to this. I have to make a choice not to do these things, but what's happening here that is feeding something within me that I want to do it in the first place? So once we start to identify those things, and again, truly, I believe a lot of it comes down to just that grieving process. And when we've talked in the past about our trauma timelines, and sometimes these are hard to identify, but I really do encourage you to kind of think about with your therapist, what are some of your trauma timeline? What's your trauma timeline? When we look at some of these trauma timelines, if you're being triggered and you have certain things in your trauma timelines, you're grieving as these ages of trauma. So if I'm trying to process grief and it's something that's happening to me that is reminding me of an abandonment that I felt when I was 3 years old, I'm struggling to get my mind around it, just like a 3-year-old might be struggling to get their mind around it, right? There has to be some compassion involved in walking me through that. And it's the same thing with our partners or loved ones or people that we're also with. They're struggling with the same things. They're struggling with the same processes. We're all a bunch of kids emotionally, really, just trying to figure all of this out. And all of us are pretty much afraid. And we're going back to that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn brain where we're just trying to figure stuff out. We're trying to manipulate, lie, fight, anything to just survive or just feel something. So if we pull all those things back and we try to find some peace, finding that peace and dealing with our grief. The grief piece of it, I believe, and again, even something as simple as you may have made a move and not realized when you made a move from this house to this house, you didn't go through a proper grieving process with it. Walk through the house and say your goodbyes. Relive some of the memories that you had. Moving forward to something else and letting something else go is a new beginning. And I encourage you to embrace new beginnings and say the goodbyes that you need to say appropriately so that grieving process will give you what you need to help you heal as you move forward then to whatever life has for you next. That's what I wanted to share today. I hope you're doing well out there. Thank you for listening.